Today on Crazed Performance Repair, we are working on a 4th gen LS-based engine. This is a GM truck, a 2007, I believe this one. Yeah, this one's a 2007 because it has the non-VVT capable camshaft, but it does have AFM equipped. We are going to be talking about the oiling system and making a specific video dedicated to the oiling system on these GM LS-based engines. So, we're going to talk about the high volume system when you're doing a delete, when you're not doing a delete, as far as a full AFM DOD type delete, what you should and should not do, what you have options of, things of that nature, because there's a lot of confusion about the oiling systems on these things, and we're going to debunk them all today. Stay tuned. We're going to start with the bottom and work our way up the engine. Now, this is the oil pan, clearly, and we're going to take care of the elephant in the room, if you will. There is all sorts of claims about this stupid valve, from GM claiming things to people on forums claiming things, so on and so forth. Now, this little valve right here is a pressure relief valve. There is a relief valve already built into the pump. However, that relief valve can only release so much oil pressure. So GM put in this unit to release extra volume when the volume is not needed because it has such a high volume pump in it. This valve right here, the misconception is that you should remove it, delete it. If you have any oil pressure issues, get it out of the system. You don't need to do that. Test it first. It's very easy to test. All you need is a little air pressure. And you can blow it right into here and see that it holds tight or releases. And when it actually lets the air pressure go, you can kind of feel it. Now, if you want to, get a regulator on your air gun and regulate it down to about 40 psi. Maybe go down to 20. If it starts releasing at 20, that spring in here is weak. I don't even go through the trouble of testing that. All I do is blow through it and clean it out because there may be a chunk of debris in here holding it open. But you do want this in the system, especially if you're going to keep the high volume pump with removing the AFM system, and I'll explain that too. However, GM claims that this is the reason for oil consumption on their engines. It is not. It is a valve cover PCV issue or concern. Now, there is oil getting stuck in the PCV. That is a whole other thing. I have a video on that, and I'll go ahead and throw it in the card up there in the corner. On that video, I have the already updated valve cover. I'm aware of that. In the video at the time, I didn't know the difference between the updated or not because both of them have the issue. Just take that with a grain of salt. It doesn't matter. Both valve covers, updated or non-updated, have the same exact concern and the same exact procedure is needed. You do need to drill it out. Anyway, GM's update claims that you put it's like a little shroud thing that you put underneath this thing, and it keeps this shielded from oil spraying up at the bottom of the pistons and getting past the rings. Their claim is that there's oil blowing past this thing so badly that the pistons and the oil rings can't get rid of the oil on the cylinder walls, and thus it consumes oil. It's totally false. It's easily debunkable. All you have to do is look at any Japanese or German engine. Pretty much all of them have oil squirters squirting at the bottom of the pistons. They have no problems. The ring design is pretty much the same. So your rings are not letting in oil unless they're seized up because you got a bunch of dirt and debris holding them in position and they can't seal any longer. Aside from that, you're not going to have a ring problem. If you do have a ring problem, it can typically be fixed with an engine flush. So this piece here, test it, reuse it. It did have Loctite on it from the factory. If you want to, just replace it. They're really cheap. I think the dealer sells them for 14 or 15 bucks at the time of this video. They're not that expensive. You can just throw a new one in. I don't think it's worth the time and energy to remove this thing out of here and block it off. The only time I would ever consider even doing that is if you were going to a standard volume pump because of deleting the system. But I also don't think a standard volume pump is necessary when deleting the system, unless you're very, very worried about making sure you get as much efficiency as possible and you're rebuilding the engine. And I'll explain that in a minute as well, too. let's go ahead and get to the engine side of things, and we're going to talk about the oil sump a little bit. So the oil sump here, it has a tendency of sucking up debris and dirt if you have a dirtier engine. Now this engine is a little bit dirtier, but somehow it did not have the debris caught up inside of it. The debris comes off of this stuff here. You can see this kind of like material here. I'll go ahead and scratch a little bit. And that material will eventually flake into the pan. This pan was really dirty, so I'm surprised it wasn't sucking it in yet. It would have soon if I hadn't had to take it apart for other reasons. But if your oil sump is plugged up, one of the symptoms you will have with this thing is when you first start it up, it'll have great oil pressure, and then as you drive it, the sludge moving around in here will get sucked into there, plug it up, and then when you shut it off, that sludge will fall down over time, settle out, and then when you start it up again later, it'll have good oil pressure until you start driving around again. If this thing gets plugged up, it's going to be very hard to deal with because most likely your whole engine is just sludged up with trash. So you'll pull the pan off. This actually happened in one of my personal vehicles. You'll pull the pan off, and then clean it out, put it back on, and you'll have the same problem after several hundred miles because your fresh oil will clean off the sludge from the sides and end up in there again. So if you have a sludge issue and you have to go to the point of pulling the pan, one of the best things you could do is pull this cover off of here and actually clean up the engine on the inside as best as possible. Now, as long as you use a non-caustic degreaser, feel free to degrease the engine first. However, be cautious when you do this because you're putting water in here, of course. You're going to want to spray everything down, and you do not want to let it sit. Because if you let it sit, all that moisture will get into things and possibly rust things, especially if you degreased it. You're going to want to either pressurize the oiling system and spray it down with oil, or you're going to have to assemble it right away that same exact day and get it running that same exact day. So it's going to be kind of a rush situation, and getting in a rush situation obviously could cause you to make mistakes. So be very cautious if you decide to degrease it. Otherwise, you're going to have to pull the pan on and off several times. Now, this is a four-wheel drive model, so doing that is not much of an option. It's going to be a son of a gun to do. If you have a two-wheel drive model, it's not a big deal to pull the pan off. Just don't RTV these corners and be prepared to pull the pan off because you're probably going to have to pull it off again after several hundred miles. Once you get rid of the main large sediment that's plugging this thing up and it's not plugging up no more, then you can just go to like doing an ATF flush, and that smaller stuff doesn't typically get stuck in here. It's just the really big crap that breaks away. The stuff that really gets stuck onto things that breaks away. This oil sump also has another very, very common problem, and it has to do with the oil sump O-ring right here. Now, this O-ring that is between the oil sump, it's actually on the oil sump and sealing against the oil pump, that O-ring can shrink down and get just not hold up very well over time. When that happens, that O-ring won't seal very well, and you can suck air from around this area here. If you get that air, it'll cavitate the pump, and you will lose oil pressure. Now, you can notice this sump is way on the front of the engine. So one way to test this if you have an oil pressure issue is to take the vehicle, find a ditch or something down along the road, find one that you're not going to get stuck in preferably, of course, and fill the oil a little over full. Go like a quart or quart and a half over full so that it brings your oil level from about here up to like up here. So maybe 2 quarts maximum over full. And then find that hill and park nose down the hill, and that oil will slosh up towards the front and submerge this thing. If suddenly your oil pressure increases, then this thing has a problem and your oil sump is leaking right at this O-ring. So that's one way to test that. Now, as far as volume of pumps, there are several different versions of pump. So here's the pump, and we were just talking about that oil sump O-ring, which is right in here. Now you can see there are 2 threaded deals. There is a part, that component, right now the factory only uses one of these holes. There's a component, like a little billet thing, that can go over some of the trucks. Now the Gen 3, it does not fit, I don't believe. The Gen 4, it does fit, and it's a little bracket that comes around and cradles the other side so you can use the other bolt hole. So I want to spit that out before I continued on the pump conversation. Now there are several different pumps. Pretty much all of them from the factory are made by Melling, I believe. There is a whole variety of LS-based Melling pumps. I'll go ahead and throw a screenshot up right here. But basically, It's all volume-based pump stuff. So you have the standard volume, the high volume, you have the high volume plus extra, and then you have the like extreme volume pump. Those are the 4 main pumps that you have. What pump do you use and when? Now, if you're doing a full AFM delete, you have to know your engine is in perfect oiling condition. And by that I mean you can't have any bad cam bearings. If you had a oil pressure issue before you took it apart, don't dare put a standard volume pump in when you're doing the AFM delete. Most people are doing an AFM delete because your AFM has failed due to lack of oil pressure activating those lifters at the time they activate it. That is when the locks inside the lifters will fail. So if you had a failed AFM system and that's why you're doing a delete, don't even bother trying to go to a standard volume pump. The only advantage of a standard volume pump is that you're going to have lower oil pressure and your motor has to work less to build that oil pressure when it's at idle and lower RPMs. This means your engine pumping less oil will use less fuel to pump said oil. So it might save you a 1/4 mile per gallon, a 1/2 mile per gallon. It's not going to save you much, if any. So, like I said, unless you know your system's great, don't bother replacing it. These pumps do not fail very often, if at all. I don't think I have actually seen a failed pump on one of these LS-based pumps. I have heard of people having failed pumps, but they didn't actually have a test or a way to test it. Now, there is one thing I could see failing, and that is right here. This guy is the port for the bleed off section of this pump. And you can kind of see the passages here. So this is where your pump volume comes out. This is where your oil pressure comes out and goes into the block. And it comes from this passage right here. You can see that kind of dip in that. And it's also got this passage down here. And this guy is bringing a passage over here. So right here is where your oil comes in. It gets pushed around, pressurizes this whole area right here, and then goes out here. This guy, there's a piston in here that allows it to bleed back over this way. So when you have a situation of you have more volume than this pressure spring is at, all it's going to do is bring the oil around and let it continue around. It'll just kind of do this, and it'll just circulate and not go into the pan, not go into the engine. It'll just kind of circulate, and this regulates how much pressure is actually going into the engine. If this can't regulate it well enough, then that's where that oil pan thing comes into play. That oil pan relief valve, if this is not enough volume from this to here to keep up with the volume of the pump, then that relief valve will start working and letting some extra oil pressure out of after this port here right directly into the pan. So that is the purpose of the secondary relief valve. The only reason is because the high volume pumps have so much more volume due to the AFM system than the standard pump does. This is a high volume performance pump, which is essentially a stock AFM pump. So, you know, you can buy all the pumps in the world, but unless you have an actual problem, it's probably not worth the effort to do. The pumps are extremely robust, again, and people replace them far too often without an actual decent reason. Prime example, my personal vehicle. I have a Tahoe. I rebuilt the engine, I put a stroker crank in it, I did all kinds of performance crap to it. It had 300,000 miles on it, okay? 300,000 miles, I pulled the pump cover off, I looked at the pump, it had a couple small scratches, I said, okay, I put it back together. My idle oil pressure when that engine is completely heated up never even dares drop below 32 psi, and that is with a standard volume Gen 3 engine. So you don't need to replace the pump. Even the standard volume has enough volume as long as your stuff is in good shape. The reason why I don't replace the high volume pumps in an AFM engine, even when I do an AFM delete, not only because it costs more money for an unnecessary expense, but most of these AFM systems have failed, and because of that, that volume is getting lost somewhere. Usually the volume is getting lost in the second camshaft bearing on these AFM engines, and this is the the 2007 Gen 4, the very first generation of the AFM in the actual pickups themselves. And this is the second cam bearing. You can see the little tit here for where the sprocket goes onto. And this is the second camshaft bearing journal here. Now, on a little later model, this actually has a slot in it. And that slot is for the variable valve timing system. It adds oil pressure through the hole here into the slot, and then, or no, backwards. It goes from the main cam journal oiling through the slot here into here, and then there's a button that gets pushed by a magnet on the front of the timing cover to activate the VVT. Now, the problem is this slot is a very large slot on those things. I'm going to grab one quick. So this is one of my known good AFM VVT camshafts that I had laying around. Now, the VVT is irrelevant to the camshaft. The camshafts, no matter what, in the newer ones, have the option for VVT. The only thing that changes it is this bolt right here. You see the little button on here? And this little bolt has some valving in it. I don't know if you'll be able to see that, but I'll try. There's a little bit of valving moving inside there. So this guy here, you see the amount of surface area that camshaft loses. And because these camshaft bearings are just really piss poor quality bearings, they tend to wear out early, and when they have this, they wear out extremely early. So one thing you can do if you're pulling this out to test it is take this camshaft, pull it out of the block, flip it around, put it in the block, and then line this up with that front bearing, and then put this in the back bearing. And what you can use is this groove here as a reference point. So if you line up the back, so we're going to go, this is the front, this is the back, right? If you line up the back of this groove, you're going to be just barely in the bearing, and you're going to be checking the very front section of where this guy is sitting. And then you put that in there, and you give it a little wiggle, and you can feel how loose it is. It's always going to have a little slop to it. But if you feel a really excessive amount of slop versus when you bring it all the way in so that the back of this is at the very front of the front bearing, and you feel it, and it feels tighter, a lot tighter, then that bearing is shot. So that's one way you can kind of take a look at that. It's a kind of a good quick test. Now, you do have to flip it over, however, because there's a much bigger gap here than is here. In fact, I can show you that by using this other camshaft here. I'll line the, see that? Much bigger gap, right? So, you have to flip the camshaft around in order to check for that. Plus, it does give you the reference point of this as a line to kind of feel it and see if it feels a lot looser in that area. So, quick way to check that. And then one last little bonus thing I want to throw in here in regards to these engines is the tensioner itself. There are two different style of tensioners, and you want to downgrade, believe it or not, to a different style of tensioner when you're replacing the timing chain. Because the older style tensioner, which is called a damper, is not a tensioner at all. It's just, it takes up a little bit of space. That's all it does. It's very simple. And I'll go ahead and grab them now so I can show you. But basically, it comes down to these things failing. So, we have, this is actually a piece of one that is on this truck right above me here. But it has failed. Actually, I dropped the bolt for that one. There we go. This is what the new one, this is what they actually look like. I'll just go ahead and open it because I'll use it eventually. So, this is what they look like. They are basically a nylon deal with a little spring backer in here. And then, of course, this is the pin that locks it into place. If you want to use this, it will create a little more accurate timing. It'd probably be better for a VVT for the sake of the VVT being able to do its job a little easier. But if you put a heavy-duty timing chain in and you put the damper in, I've done it many times, the VVT will be fine as well. So I like to avoid these because they're too prone to failure. I've seen too many of them broken. Sometimes they'll create a hell of a noise, and other times they won't. Now, what I do instead, when I replace those, is I put what's called a timing damper in here. And it is a simple little plastic thing. I'm going to use this on this one, so I'll open it too. just a simple little plastic thing, and it actually goes right in between. You can see where the bolt holes line up there. So the bolt holes there, they just go right there. And instead of going to the outside, so this goes to the outside of the chain here, the inside of the chain here, all it does is go on the inside of the chain for both sides, and it helps to keep the chain out a little bit, so when all that weight of the chain is going around, it just stays out instead of flopping back and forth when you slow it down. So this is a timing damper. Very, very simple device. There's nothing to fail here, no moving parts, and they pretty much last forever. So go to a timing damper instead of a timing chain. I'll go and throw the part number on here. 9-5417 by Crazed is what this one happens to be. And while you're in there, if you can get one of these, feel free to get your cam plate too. Now, when you're doing these, the torque spec on these tapered screw style is extremely low. I mean, it's like 11 foot-pounds or something. It's really, really low. I forget the exact spec. Don't go off of that. Look it up. I forgot the spec. I should know it. I do enough of these. But if you over-torque these, this one in particular will break off. I made that mistake on one of the first long ago that I ever did. I thought, that's it? No way that bolt's going to hold. I thought, yeah, I can torque it a little more than that. As soon as I torqued it just a little bit more, snapped the ear right off. Okay, that's shot. Now, another common misconception with the oiling system, and the reason I'm talking about these is because a lot of people replace these thinking that this is going to help their oil pressure issue. It's extremely unlikely that it's going to help your oil pressure issue. You can see the kind of gasket embossed into here. Now, this one is completely flat, and if you're deleting the system, you definitely don't need to replace this unless you see that it's worn out. It is where the cam kind of rides on, but you don't need to replace this because you're going to have the extra volume to not need for the AFM anyway, as long as you don't replace that pump. And besides, when they leak, it's very, very little. In fact, if you look at the pump here, you have the bolt holes here and this metal surface. It's just a flat machine surface is all it is. And there is no gasket here. They're not worried about a gasket here. They have a small gasket here. And that gasket is really, really not raised very much at all. I wish I could kind of show you how much raise it has here. You can feel it on here, but it's not very much. In fact, I think... Oh yeah, this one's got a bad spot in it from the factory. Wow. I wonder if I can show you guys that here. I'm going to try and get you a close-up and zoom the camera in on it in the editing. So hopefully you can see that little imperfection in there. This one is the non-tapered style. You can see it's just flat here. This is for the older style engine. And I bought this for mine, and it didn't come in time. I ended up using one of the tapered one. It's my vehicle though, so I'm kind of like, whatever, I need to get it together. I wasn't worried about it anyway, to be honest. They're just, it'll hold. It'll be fine. Bunch of Loctite, it'll be fine. But there is the little cover for that unit there, and it really doesn't lose oil pressure through that. That would be a very, very rare occurrence. I had to move the camera, sorry. What else about these oiling systems? That basically sums up the more common issues with oil pressure loss and these oiling systems and what to expect, what you should do, what you shouldn't do. But there are a couple smaller things that I should probably spit out there. So I'm going to throw over here a little diagram of what the oiling system is. And you can see, hopefully looking at this diagram, that this is a priority filter oiling system, I guess you would call it. So it goes from the sump to the pump, from the pump down a main oil galley, and then when it gets to that oil galley, it hits a little plunger. It's like a dumbbell looking thing, and that dumbbell is what diverts it down into the oil filter. The dumbbell does not have a seal on the end of it where it diverts it. It's just a close tolerance fit. So some of the oil pressure or oil that comes from the pump directly will get past that thing and go straight to the system, but not very much because it's a really close fit and it's almost self-filtering, if that makes sense, just because it's such a tight fit in there. As far as what oil does get past that, the rest of the oil goes down into the filter, and that's important because that prevents all the debris that might get sucked up into that engine from going into your main bearings, your rod bearings, things like that, and it will prevent the damage there. It's also important because it's useful in diagnosing. If you have a low oil pressure issue, you may end up with a filter causing your low oil pressure. So, before you go diving in too deep into all this oil pressure concern stuff and all these different variables, make sure you check the filter. Because if your filter is plugged up with sludge, then your filter is going to restrict the oil flow going up into the engine and you will lose oil pressure. So change your filter out. Then from there, that oil pressure goes up alongside the back of the block and it goes into the main lifter galley areas, I guess you could call them. So the one downside to the LS system is that the oiling on these things, it literally oils the lifters before it even oils the crank. That's kind of messed up, I'm not going to lie. But it goes up to the main oil passages. There's 2 of them along each side of the camshaft that oil the lifters, one of which has a hole drilled from the mains all the way up alongside the camshaft. So now it goes up to the lifter, down to the camshaft, then into the crank and rods. The strange thing though, even though it feeds the oil to the crankshaft last, the bottom end of these engines is very, very solid, has very little problems. Of course, anything can fail, but in relativity to the top end of the engine, the bottom end is very solid. So, is what it is, but keep that in mind when you're trying to diagnose these systems. All the oil pressure goes to the bottom side of the lifters first before anywhere else aside from the filter. So, your lifters should have full pressure, and then that port that also goes up to the back of those, and in fact, grab this guy. This is it by that cam plate. It goes up to one of the ports there, and it goes up to your oil sending unit. That one port goes all the way down to this. Then there's a passage, goes all the way to here. There's also a passage at the back of the block that goes the other direction. So it's got 2 of these weird openings, front and rear of the engine, that allow it to go both directions. I was just thinking I have a block right there, but that's not going to work for showing you because I got the timing cover on it. But basically, the oil comes around both sides to that other side where the lifters are, and this is underneath the lifters, which is important because the reason these AFM lifters function properly is because there's a port on the side of the lifter for the AFM lifters. Right here, it's this little circle, and that has to face the top of the block. If for any reason the guide fails that holds this lifter into place, which is a total pile of crap and fails often, and this thing rotates, and it tends to rotate 180 because it has a roller on it, now that oil port will be facing the main oil galley. And of course, that will tell the lifter, hey, you got to collapse. Never mind this washer on there. I have that so I remember what lifter this is. There's some damage in here I got to display a little later for you guys. Anyway, so that port in the main oil galley will get full oil pressure as soon as you start the engine. So the lifter, you crank it over by hand, will look like it's functioning. But the moment you start the truck, the lifter will stop working. And then of course, your rocker won't move, your valve won't open, and your engine won't run on that cylinder. The standard lifters are a totally different animal because they have this large groove in here. Now these are unidirectional. They can flip either direction. It doesn't matter. They have the same flat on both sides. They have the oiling hole is this little hole right here, and that's only for the hydraulic portion of the lifter. It has nothing to do with AFM. And of course, that oiling hole gets its oil by this little cutout that's in here to access this groove that goes all the way around. Now that is why these lifters cannot function in an AFM port with the VLOM, V-L-O-M, for Valley Lifter Oil Manifold still in place on the vehicle. These lifters will dry out, they won't work properly, and you will have no oil pressure because that manifold is designed to release pressure. The only time it activates the AFM is when it feeds pressure to that little port that I just showed you in the side of the AFM lifter. I think that pretty much sums up understanding the oiling systems in these AFM systems and all the little caveats that they come with. So if this video helps you out at all and helps you figure out whatever's wrong with your particular LS-based engine, feel free to leave a comment below. Let me know. Like, share, subscribe, and as always, I hope to see you on the next video. Thanks for watching. All these parts. Parts. Keep them all on hand. A lot of parts.